very, very honored and grateful that Professor Mintzberg accepted to join us this evening to launch this summer school. And without further ado, I invite our guest speaker, Henry Mintzberg, as well as the two co-directors of Mosaic HEC Montréal, Patrick Cohen-Day and Laurent Simon, to please come up on the stage to launch this evening's discussion.
In a recent interview, you were asked the following question. Are you an innovator? Are you an influencer? Or are you an iconoclast?
What's the third one?
Iconoclast.
Iconoclast.
Iconoclast, yeah. And I think without hesitating 1 second, you say, I am an iconoclast. Iconoclast? Anyway. So to the iconoclast, and also to one of the main voices in management today, my question is the following. First, among all these pieces of work, which is your preferred one? Second, among all these pieces of work, which is the work you think has the most influence on managers, organizations, or maybe academic world? And my third question is, among these pieces of work, which one you think were not understood, or not yet understood, or not adopted, or even be rejected?
Bon, c'est fastoche. mais je vais parler en anglais. Il y a juste une petite histoire personnelle quant au mot fastoche, je vais le dire en français. Quand ma fille avait 3-4 ans en France, elle voulait appuyer sur un bouton dans un ascenseur et ma femme a dit « mais c'est difficile, ça, tu ne peux pas le faire ». Elle venait d'arriver en France il y a 2 ou 3 ans, 2 ou 3 semaines. Non, elle venait de commencer l'école il y a 2 ou 3 semaines. Et elle a dit « mais c'est fastoche, maman ». Une Québécoise, 3 ans. Anyway. Interesting question. I always say my favorite book in terms of my own books, in terms of its synthesis and its flow is the book you were talking about, the structuring of organizations, structure dynamique des organisations. It kind of flows from beginning to end and in a certain way. And I actually did for that one what I've never done before or since. I did about a 200-page outline for that book. And once I did the 200-page outline, which took a long time, I wrote the first draft in 3 months. And that's 500 pages of little type. I had to put in all the references and all that after. But, so I think it's my favorite book in that respect. And it's by far my most successful book, both in sales and in influence. I think it had, it's the book that people still use and still talk about, and it opens people up to the whole notion of organizations. My least appreciated book, I think, is my last, Rebalancing Society, and that's not just because it's recent. Came out in January of 2015. It's not because it's the most recent, it's because it hasn't really gone anywhere. And it sort of surprises me because I think its messages, in terms of my favorite books, I think the message in that book is my favorite. I think it's the most important thing I've done. It hasn't particularly caught on. It hasn't sold a lot of copies. The French translation isn't even out yet. I think it's coming out soon.
Maybe we can do something.
Push it a little, yeah. But the Brazilian translation came out months ago, 6 months ago. And usually my books are translated into French pretty quickly. But I think it's my most important, we'll get into it, but I think it's my most important book. And influence, least understood, what else did you?
Not this one,
I just, of the words you mentioned, innovator, influencer, iconoclast, contrarian you didn't mention because I don't think I'm contrarian. Contrarian in English means to be against things because you're against them. And I'm against things because I find them stupid.
Okay. If I may, if we come back to your last book, Rebalancing Society, which to a large extent is a unique opportunity to understand the crisis, but also offers avenues for thinking the renewal of society. You express in this book, I quote, that a healthy society balances a public sector of respected government, a private sector of responsive businesses, and a plural sector of robust communities. And then you had this very striking paradox, which is that just after the collapse of the Soviet regime in Eastern countries, everyone expected that capitalism has triumphed. And in fact, you say the situation got worse and worse. Today, society is in balance, and mostly because there is an excess of private sector. My question is, could you argue a little bit on that? But my question is the following, coming back to your frustration, is when I listen to let's say, the presidential election campaign in the United States, the excess of power of Wall Street is right in the middle of the debate. Maybe one of the main debate. And is not Mintzberg winning there?
Is not Mintzberg
winning? You have influence.
Oh, I'm winning.
The debate.
Well, even if I was, nobody would perceive it that way, not in the United States, but no. I think what may be winning is a perception of the power of Wall Street, but not what to do about it. And I don't think it's getting better. I think it's getting steadily worse. I spoke in Brazil last October, and a question I asked was, which country is more corrupt, the United States or Brazil? And I said, I'll give you a hint, the answer is not Brazil. Because, for a very simple reason, despite what's going on in Brazil now, the corruption in Brazil is criminal. And they're dealing with it, finally, they're dealing with it in courts of law. The corruption in America is legal, and they can't deal with it. The corruption in America is legal because of the money that's entered political campaigns, because the National Rifle Association has every legal right to bribe politicians. Bribery is legal in the United States and endemic. It's an illness in the United States, and organizations like the what do you call it? Anyway, I lost my train of thought. But it's that kind of thing is legal in the United States, and chambers of commerce. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on. Hillary Clinton's being accused of being funded by Wall Street, and so on and so forth. What, she'll be president, pretty likely, and what is she going to do about Wall Street? She'll do some token things. You know, the most striking thing about America today, recently, is you literally had a case last week where the National Rifle Association gave Congress permission to make the tiniest little step on gun control. They gave them permission. They didn't use that word, but it was quite clear. They were saying that all the congressmen we bought off, it's okay if you don't give guns to terrorists. Mind-blowing what's going on in the country. The situation in the United States, I think, gets worse. The perception of it is clearer, that it's a problem, and the frustration for me with my book is I tried to explain why that's going on, and that message I haven't heard from anybody, and it's in the book. Anybody, you can all read it as soon as you can read it for free, because I got the publisher to agree to post it as the book. Not just the pamphlet I did earlier, but as the book on my website, so you can just download it tonight and read it. You should read it tonight, really.
Is there a country which is balanced on today, or was there a country that was balanced in the past?
Well, the usual suspects, I think, the Scandinavian countries are more balanced than most. Germany is rather, we should say, because I didn't come back to public-private plural, but we should say, just to repeat what you were saying, you wanted me to elaborate, that balance to me is balance across the three sectors. And the communist regimes collapsed in 1989 because there was complete imbalance. The public sector dominated all the Eastern European countries. Really, the Russians dominated, but it was public sector domination. The idea that capitalism triumphed was dead wrong because balance triumphed. We were balanced compared to now. We in the West, whether it's Western Europe or North America, whatever, the democratic countries were balanced across public, private. Public sector was strong here, much stronger here than now. Then than now. The private sector has always been strong, whether it's Canada or Quebec or the US or anywhere else, any democratic country. And the plural sector, meaning the sector of organizations that are neither public nor private, like HEC, is neither public nor, it's not owned by the government, it's not owned privately. McGill, same, Greenpeace, same, and so on and so forth. We're strong. Ever since then, the private sector has taken over so much power and now dominates governments and dominates, globally dominates governments and domestically dominates governments. So where's balance other than those European countries? My favorite example is still Brazil. The plural sector in Brazil is absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And nobody is saying the public sector isn't strong in Brazil. They're just saying it's corrupt. But it's powerful. And the private sector is perfectly good in Brazil. I don't mean the corruption in Petrobras, but I mean the fact that there's a strong private sector. So Brazil for me points the way more than any other country because it has the courage to do things unlike a lot of other countries. Right now it's in a hiatus, but it'll get back. And the stuff it does, whether it's ethanol and gas tanks or Bolsa Familia, where every family gets money for its children as long as they're in school and get injections, get vaccine injections, and so on. Amazing things go on in that country. I include Quebec. I mean, I include Canada generally, pre and post Harper. I think this was an aberration, this guy, an aberration for 10 years. And Quebec more than the rest of the country, although I think the rest of the country reflects it. But Quebec more so because the plural sector, civil society, is very strong in Quebec. The sense of community here is very strong. And government has always been more activist in Quebec than in probably any other place in North America. So I include Quebec. But in terms of pointing the way and having the guts to face up to things, Brazil, more than any other country.
Okay. Maybe a last question on this book is about the plural sector. I think reading your book, you really consider that the strength and the potential of renewal society is within the plural sector. First, could you elaborate on that? What is really the plural sector? And then maybe two questions. What the public government can do to enhance the plural sector? And second, is there a danger today to see the private sector taking control of the plural sector, exploiting the plural sector? If I take the case of Uber or Airbnb, to some extent, it's a takeover, or it's a strength that capture the value of the plural sector, and what government should do to balance this tendency.
Well, not what our current government is doing here in Quebec, for sure. I think the first thing government can do is recognize that there is a plural sector and recognize and respect it and build on it, which has been done generally in Quebec, but less so now. I personally think the new health reforms in Quebec, which are absolutely stark raving crazy, have in effect nationalized all our hospitals. They've in effect made our hospitals government agencies instead of private hospitals funded by the government. So if our government woke up, that would be a nice first step. Why the plural sector for change? Because in so many places in the world, in most places in the world, the public sector has been terribly depreciated, partly because of this whole move to reduce taxes and deny government certain funding, and replace it with sales taxes, which are absolutely non-progressive. So Canadian corporations pay among the lowest taxes in the world, for example, and so governments are starved. Sure, they do a lot of waste, and sure, they do a lot of bad things, but they're also starved in a certain sense. The healthcare system, for example, I'm doing a book called Managing the Myths of Healthcare, and it strikes me that the healthcare system is suffering from success, not from failure. That physicians and pharmaceutical companies have a great ability to develop very expensive treatments, and we don't want to pay for them. So I, as a sick person, want the treatment and want the government to pay everything, even if it's $500,000 to save my life. But the government, but you who are well don't want, don't want to pay that much taxes. Or I, as someone who's well, don't want to pay that much taxes. And so we squeeze, and then the government intervenes in all kinds of crazy, dysfunctional ways, and damages the system terribly. But in terms of balance across the sectors, governments are weaker, the private sector is stronger, the private sector is dominating the public sector just about anywhere, and particularly through globalization. So you have trade tribunals. I don't know if people are aware of these trade tribunals. They're written into all the new pacts, including NAFTA and so on, where companies can sue governments for legislating in ways that decrease their profits. It's like a madhouse. Governments aren't allowed to legislate for the sake of the population because it might cut into some profits of some companies, and this is considered normal today. So governments are weak, and I think it's not a question of governments reinforcing the plural sector, it's a question of people in the plural sector waking up and forcing their governments, our governments, to act. Now, who is in the plural sector? Everybody in this room is in the plural sector. You may work in the private sector, you may vote in the public sector, but you live in the plural sector. I'll bet there's not one person in this room who hasn't interacted personally with 5 plural sector organizations in the last week. If you're at HEC, that's one. If you done something with Greenpeace, if you went to the Y, just think of all the organizations you've dealt with in the last week that are neither public nor private. We're all the plural sector, and we all have to wake up to the fact that we have to act, whether it's global warming, which is the most sort of direct confrontation problem right now, or anything else. And we've got to do it through the plural sector, and the plural sector has to wake up both the public sector and the private sector. There's wonderful forms of corporate social responsibility going on. It will not solve the problem. There's too much corporate social irresponsibility going on. And the Americans think you're going to fix the problem by fixing the private sector. No, you're going to fix the problem by balancing power across the 3 sectors.
So, you started your career talking about management and then strategy and then political science somehow. If we try to close the loop a little bit and going back to strategy, rebalancing society is one thing. Maybe today there's an issue in rebalancing companies, rebalancing firms. Again, even inside organizations, people are somehow members of informal bodies, social groups,
Yeah.
And we can argue that even in organizations today, we can identify this third dimension, this plural sector inside organizations. So how could organizations try to assess for that and maybe adapt and learn to work with this third dimension?
Yeah, a word I like, I kind of created in a way. We have citizenship, which is for everybody. We have leadership, or ownership, which is more individual, and we have communityship. If we have citizenship and leadership and ownership, then we should have communityship. And I've always maintained for years, that a healthy organization, a business or otherwise, but particularly businesses, are not collections of human resources. Human resources has to be the worst term that's ever been created. I mean, we take it for granted. We think, yeah, sure, human resources. It's awful. I'm not a human resource. I'm a human being. I'm not a human resource. I'm not human capital. I'm not a human asset. I'm a human being. And yet we run too many of our companies as collections of human resources. Well, if you have a resource like coal and you don't need it, you throw it away or give it away or sell it or whatever. And we treat people like that. If people are human resources, you don't need 5,000 of them, get rid of them. Or more to the point, you didn't make your numbers on Wall Street or in the Canadian Stock Exchange. Whoops. See, somebody's against this.
I guess.
If you didn't, is the microphone working? If you didn't meet your numbers on, for the stock analysts, then you fire 5,000 people. That's going to solve your problem. Well, effective organizations are communities of human beings. They're not collections of human resources. And people are important, and depending on how you treat them. But today it's taken for granted that we mistreat people, and it's okay if we don't make our numbers and the chief executive doesn't get usually his bonus, then you fire thousands of people. It's disgusting. It's disgraceful. And it does enormous harm. If a company is going bankrupt, sure, it has to lay people off. We're not talking, Pfizer doesn't go bankrupt when it doesn't make quite the profits it used to. So and yet, it's engaged in those kind of behaviors. They've all engaged, most companies have engaged in those behaviors. And it kills, because everybody inside is saying, I'll cover my rear end because I could be next. So what you refer to as kind of plural sector, I'm not sure plural sector, but communityship within companies is critical. It's absolutely. The companies we love are companies that treat their people really well.
In this, we mentioned the books, but a few of your papers were also really defining. This paper in HBR in 2009, where you mentioned communityship. And at some point, we could argue again that not taking into account communityship could be counterproductive for those organizations themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see it in companies that do well and do consistently well. And, if you compare a Costco with a Walmart or something, they pay their people more at Costco. There seems to be more respect for the staff. So there's, and we appreciate that, and we like that. And we just need to see more of that.
And what could it mean in terms of strategy for organizations to be more aware and maybe respectful of this dimension?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about an HR strategy, a human resource, an HB strategy, a human being strategy. Sure, I mean, strategy for me usually defines how a company positions itself in the marketplace. But if you're an Uber maneuvering around everything you possibly can, waltzing into an industry that was controlled for good reason, in some ways, people bought the number of taxis that were allowed in an area, and people had to buy there, and they had to show that they were capable of driving taxis and so on. Uber just comes in and waltzes in and incredibly aggressive. It's amazing how many of the new famous companies are pit bull companies. They're pit bull companies. They're really nasty. I mean, a lot of them are really nasty. Uber's waking up, but sure, it's waking up. It's got so much to lose now. But we've got to sort of wake up to that kind of stuff going on, I think. But the companies that we adore and that we we respect and so on are companies that have a certain flair. I write a weekly blog. If you can't go home and read my book, at least read my blog, which is mintzberg.org/blog or at Mintzberg141. The blog I'm doing, which will go up probably day after tomorrow, compares, it opens by saying, it's been said that there are two kinds of people, those who believe there are two kinds of people and those who don't. I don't know about that, but I know that there are two kinds of companies, those that believe in customer service and those who believe in serving their customers. So I don't need to be smiled at when I walk into a Walmart. I couldn't care less about that, but real customer service. One of the examples I use is if I wanted to go to Boston tomorrow morning, let's say a friend died and I had to go to Boston tomorrow morning, and there's only one carrier that goes to Boston, which is Air Canada. Do you know how much a ticket to go one way to Boston, which is a flight that's less than 1 hour? Do you know how much the ticket is today? Almost 1,100 Canadian dollars. Sorry, a bit more. I would have to pay $2,300 to go to Boston and back tomorrow on a short-term ticket. Is that customer service? Is that serving customers? What they're saying is, if we compete to Toronto, we'll do everything to get you and get your business. But if we don't have to compete to Boston, you're the same guy who buys these other tickets. Screw you, we're going to hit you for as much money as we possibly can. This is how Air Canada seems to be run these days. I don't give a damn if they've got a monopoly on the route to Boston. This is disgraceful treatment of their customers. And it's just normal. It's normal.
What could happen against that?
What could stop it? If people start to say, you know what, screw you, I'm not flying. I'm going to fly Porter to Toronto from now on until you wake up. I mean, if a lot of people did that, that would wake them up. You know how long it would take? A week, if that. It would take 3 days. If many of their customers said, you know what, you're not going to rip us off anymore on this particular thing where you're struggling to get our business elsewhere. We're going to, if 500 people wrote to Air Canada and said, I'm not flying Air Canada to Toronto anymore until you change your flights to Boston, they'd change them.
So again, it's an issue of the plural sector, being able to...
Yeah, in a way, yeah, sure. It's because we're acting spontaneously and personally, not personally, but as a group. That's right.
Yes.
That is plural. That's an example of plural sector act.
I guess we have the tools to do it.
With social media and Twitter and everything else, of course we do. Of course we do. We sit there passively. And they pick off the occasional sucker who has to go to Boston on a short term.
Well, so there's also an issue of organizing this plural sector.
Yes, absolutely. You know, absolutely. That's what I call the big issue in the plural sector. The private sector companies compete with each other. They can compete viciously. You know, 2 gas stations will compete on 2 corners. They'll compete viciously with each other. But when it comes to common interest, like lowering taxes, they get their collective act together through the Chamber of Commerce, or through the IMF, or through the through the World Trade Association, whatever it is. Business knows how to get its act together. Davos is an example of where business gets its collective act together. The plural sector does not get its collective act together. It just doesn't. And until it does, it's going to be marginalized. I wish they didn't turn the lights on in the room, because frankly, I like to see who I'm talking to. I don't care about the television enregistrement. I want to see. Can we get a little light so we can see who's here, please? We'll see how responsive Ashley is.
That was a test.
The answer is evident. Yeah. Because I want to ask you something. How many people in this room have ever heard of the World Social Forum and that it's meeting in Montreal for the first time in a developed country this summer? Raise your hands. Amazing. Absolutely shocking. What about, I can't tell exactly, maybe 10, 15 hands. The World Social Forum was created in response to the World Economic Forum. Seems logical. And it's the place where the plural sector gets together. It started in Brazil. It's met in various countries, what they call in the south. And for the first time in history, it's meeting in the north, which is in your own city, in Montreal, in August. There are between 50 and 80,000 people expected to come, and hardly anybody in this room's ever even heard of it. It's your own city. I don't blame you. It's just, it's the nature of the sector. Just, people don't know. We should all, I think it's $20 or $40, you can register and go to all the events. But that's, and I'm doing several, we're doing a whole day workshop in the McGill Winter Stadium, the McGill Alouette Stadium, this sports stadium, on this very issue of how we deal with global warming, how we deal with getting this sector act together. People are going to just sit on the grass and work with each other from around the world. So, but it's an example of the sector just being invisible. On one hand, it's invisible because people don't know it as a sector. On the other hand, as I said, everybody in this room has interacted with all kinds of organizations in this sector in the last few days.
That's an interesting issue of organizations. Talking about organizations means we have to talk about organizers, managers.
Yeah.
So you were probably one of the harshest critics of management education.
Yeah.
I think we still have to be critics today. Yeah. So you talked a lot about MBAs, you talked a lot about their flaws and maybe their dangers. Yeah. What could change today? What should change today in terms of management education?
Well, it's no different than I've always been saying. It's just that it's never changed much. It's the same old problem. If you read my book, Managers, Not MBAs, you're going to see the same old problems. MBA programs are excellent at training specialists or training people in the functions of business. MBA programs do fine, which is marketing, finance, accounting, strategy, HR, whatever it is. Those are not management. Nobody gets trained to be a manager in an MBA in a regular MBA program, an ordinary MBA program, which almost all are that. Because you can't create a manager in a classroom. Management is like swimming without going near the water. You can learn all the theory you like about swimming. You got to get in the water to learn how to swim. And people learn management by doing it. Then once they're managers, they can learn enormously wonderful things about management by reflecting on their own experience. But most EMBA programs, so-called executive, I never met an executive in an executive MBA program, but anyway, these are programs for experienced managers, and most of them just imitate regular MBA programs. And the reason they do that is because it's easy for the faculty. After all, if I taught 22-year-olds marketing, then I can use the same cases and the same stuff to teach 35-year-olds marketing. You know, why should I bother adapting to their experience? The exception is the McGill HEC EMBA program and the early... No, but it's true. It's a completely different program. We created a program at McGill with other schools around the world 20 years ago. And it was built on the premise that number one is for managers. Number two, they come temporarily, so they come for 10-day modules over a year and a half. Number three, we build the whole pedagogy around them learning from each other and from their own experience. So we can drop in our pearls of wisdom on strategy and on negotiating skills and all these other things. But the key is they run with these things, they sit at round tables, and they discuss among themselves. They reflect on their own experience among each other, among themselves, and then they share it. First they reflect personally, and then they share it around the table, and then it's shared across the classroom. So we have a 50-50 rule that says half the time over to the managers on their agendas. It's not so hard when you have people with experience. So the McGill HEC program was created, I don't know, about 6 or 8 years ago, maybe longer, and used that model that we had in the IMPM, the International Master's Program for Managers, which goes around the world. It runs modules in China and Brazil and India and England and here. And the McGill HEC program does the same thing for a more local community because the modules are shorter. And then we have a healthcare program called the International Masters for Health Leadership that is run all at McGill, mostly at McGill, and does the same kind of thing. So those three programs are the way things can go. And some schools are adapting little by little. Most aren't.
So we need MPA, Masters in Plural Administration?
Yeah, or Masters for Managers. We need Masters for Managers. Most of the MBA programs are not for managers.
In a recent world survey, IBM Global Consulting asked 1,400 managers, CEOs all over the world, about their most pressing concern. And the answer was what we have to do. That was 60-something% of the CEOs. They answered, we need to embody creative leadership.
We need which?
To embody. We need more creative leadership.
Embody creative leadership.
How would you react to that?
Negatively. Est-ce que je dois dire d'autres choses?
Well, let's keep up with this one. In a famous paper in HBR with Jonathan Gosling, you identified five mindsets for managers. Reflective mindset, action mindset, collaborative mindset, worldly mindset, analytical mindset. Shouldn't we need a more creative, plural, innovative mindset?
Yeah, but I want to go back to the other question. I can't deny that leadership is important. Of course leadership's important. But we so overemphasize it, we make such a bloody fuss about leadership that we forget everything else. And great leaders are people who encourage communityship in organizations. They're much more humble. This idea of embodying creative leadership somehow means we, as leaders, have to be more creative. Let me tell you how IKEA came up with a strategy for selling unassembled furniture. It's my favorite story of strategy. A worker, not a manager, a worker tried to this is on their website, a worker tried to put a table in his car and it didn't fit, so he took the legs off. And somebody was smart enough to say, wait a minute, if we have to take the legs off, maybe our customers do too. And then IKEA was smart enough to be able to convey this message to enough people so that finally a board or someone said, that's not a bad idea. But it didn't come from the board. It didn't come from creative leadership at all. Let me say a word after about creativity. I want to say a word about, or I could say it now. I'll come back to it in a minute. So strategy grows out of people in the organization who learn. And people, probably the people least capable of learning are the people in the executive towers because they're farthest removed from customers and workers and things that are happening on the ground. The learning happens where you interact with a customer. The learning happens when you see what's going on in the factory. The learning happens when your sleeves are rolled up and you're involved. And so it's, they might say, yeah, well, that's what we mean by creative leadership. Everybody should be a leader. But that's still individualism. It's kind of, because the key to the IKEA story is not that this guy had to take the legs off the table. The key to the story was that there was some kind of collective response that enabled the company to see it as a strategic opportunity. By the way, it took 15 years for them to introduce that strategy. So consultants would say, we'll give it to you in 2 weeks. So
it's more about creative communityship.
It's more about creative communityship. I wish they would have used that term, but I don't expect it. Let me say a word about creativity. I think there's two kinds of creativity. There's what I call spontaneous or spectacular creativity. It's like Tchaikovsky writing the violin concerto. I don't know how anybody could be that brilliant. Or Picasso painting Guernica or something like that. This is a spectacular form of creativity. The other form of creativity is more important, and it's ordinary creativity. The guy who took the legs off the car, off the table, or the one who at least recognized the significance of that, was being creative in a very ordinary way. I mean, it didn't take genius. It took a little switch, right? It took a little switch. It took a little switch from I have to do it to they have to do it. It took that little switch. But a lot of the great things in history had that little switch. When Fleming looked at his mold that had killed his bacteria in his samples, and then suddenly the idea came, well, wait a minute, if the mold is killing bacteria in my samples, maybe we can use the mold to kill bacteria in the body. That became penicillin. He named it penicillin right away, and it became antibiotics. Probably the greatest medical advance ever, just a little switch. Anybody in this room who can tell a joke is capable of doing that, because jokes are switches. I'll give you a joke. I'm a grandfather. I'll give you a joke. This guy says, I want to die like my grandfather died, quietly in his sleep. Not like the other people in the car who died yelling and screaming. So it doesn't take genius. It's a little switch. Grandpa wasn't in bed. Grandpa was driving the car. It's just a little switch. But that little switch is what makes it a joke. Well, if you can tell a joke like that, and you've probably done 10 this week, then you could be that kind of creative person at work. It's just a little switch, and somebody has to be listening.
Getting back to the table example, it's not a solitary phenomenon. It's a collective phenomenon. So
Yes.
creativity,
Yeah.
you can leave it on your own, but
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's a collective kind of activity. It doesn't mean that individuals don't get ideas. Fleming got the idea. It's just that it takes sort of more than that to bring it to fruition.
so that could be one of the responsibilities of management, to be able to...
Yes, sure. Because, absolutely. Because where management comes in that story, they didn't write that part up, but where management would presumably have come in that story is, number one, recognizing the benefit of that. That's pretty far-reaching. It changed IKEA dramatically. Think of all the things they had to change to do that. But it had a management that recognized the potential for that, and then it had a management that drove it forward in terms of all the new ways of new catalogs and new displays and new designs and new ways of assembling furniture and so on.
Interesting challenge.
That's why it took 15 years. But presumably they started with a table and then expanded from there. I've been told, I don't know if it's true, that IKEA sells houses like that in Russia. Mm-hmm. They sell kitchens like that, right? That you assemble yourself, that we know. Apparently in Russia they sell houses. I don't know if they still do, but they sell houses like that. So it's just expanding the same idea.
Yeah. Maybe on a more lighter tone, we were discussing organizational creativity, human creativity, but you can find creativity in nature. And I think Patrick wanted to share something about it.
Je vais finir en français, si je peux me permettre. Et vous poser peut-être une question personnelle en regardant sur votre site, mais aussi grâce à, par exemple, un ami commun qui est Stéphane Coudet, qui est ici et qui vous connaît bien, et qu'on remercie beaucoup puisqu'il a facilité nos échanges aujourd'hui. On sait que vous avez un intérêt, une passion pour les canards, pour les castors, for the beaver sculptures.
Yeah.
Et cette passion pour, je dirais, les écosystèmes naturels, en quoi éventuellement ça a influencé votre regard ou vos passions pour les écosystèmes industriels ou sociaux? Is there a link between?
Well, I was on a canoe trip years ago in the Des Moines River, and I saw this thing floating in the water where the beavers had left it behind, and I kind of liked it. So yeah, actually, no, it's not in the, yeah. So I kind of liked it. So I picked it up. We had to take it through all the portages and everything. And then I started collecting. So you can see, you know what this is? If you go back, I don't know, can we go back? A neighbor brought me that because we have a house on a lake, believe it or not, called Lac Castor. And it's not the only one in Quebec, but and he said when beavers can't find rocks to put in the base of their dams, they make rocks. So that's an example. And so I started to collect. J'ai une collection assez. J'attends une occasion, une opportunité de montrer l'exposition à MoMA, mais je ne crois pas pour l'instant. Museum of Modern Art. Il y a une Québécoise qui était, je ne sais pas si Marie-Josée Drouin, Marie-Josée Kravis est toujours le chair de MoMA, mais elle n'est pas. She's not in a big rush to do that. So I started collecting, and this is on the bathrooms for the children. I call it the zoo. These are all just the way I took them. I never take them off the dams. Jamais des barrages, jamais des auberges. I take them from the water, floating, or from the bottom of the water lake, or from the shore. And I just take them as they are, just clean them. That's all. The link, I think it's just this farfelu, I guess is the word farfelu, this kind of playful way of dealing with things. And I think I'm playful with my blog, and I'm playful. We're too serious, you know, so I'm playful with my books. And I'm not. You know, people say I'm courageous for some of the things I write. I think that's ridiculous. I sit in my desk and I write. What's courageous about that? This is a fantastic one that was just picked up a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But look at the red, and it's amazing. I have about 50 that could be displayed. So if you're running a museum, I'd like to do it actually seriously in the Museum of Nature in Ottawa. That would be an obvious place.
Okay. That could happen maybe at Espace pour la Vie in Montreal.
Yeah. It should be displayed. I mean, they're really fun.
J'aimerais vraiment remercier le professeur Mintzberg au nom de HEC Montréal, de Mosaic, d'être venu partager ses pensées, son humour. Pour l'invitation pour l'école d'été l'an prochain, je souligne que les dates sont déjà choisies. Donc, c'est du 22 juin au 8 juillet. Alors, vous êtes plus qu'invités à vous joindre à nous. Et tous ceux aussi qui ne l'auront peut-être pas fait dans la salle, vous aussi, vous êtes invités l'an prochain. I would like to take this opportunity to actually, this event is to launch this edition of the summer school. So I'd just like to ask the participants of this edition of the summer school to just stand up and welcome you and wish you a happy journey. So we have 12 countries, 50 people. So et avant de vous inviter tous au cocktail, j'aimerais souligner le soutien du ministère de l'Économie, des Sciences et de l'Innovation, de l'École des dirigeants, et j'aimerais aussi beaucoup remercier l'équipe Mosaic qui a vraiment travaillé très, très fort. Donc, on vous invite à prendre un cocktail. Merci beaucoup.